Hi, good afternoon, folks. So we're going to give it another minute here to wait to see if anybody else would like to join on. Just as a reminder, before we start, this preservation conversation is being recorded and will be included on our Preservation Massachusetts website and our YouTube channel. So if you don't want to have your face seen on a YouTube video, you can go ahead and turn off your screen. So we'll give it another minute here. All right, it's a couple minutes after noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. My name's Joe Ritter. I'm the Program and Advocacy Manager here at Preservation Massachusetts. And I'd like to welcome you to Most Endangered Resources 101. This is the first of several preservation conversations that we'll be hosting this year, talking about the Most Endangered Resource Program. So I'm glad all of you can join. I'll go ahead and share my screen now, so bear with me. All right. There we go. So for those of you who are new to our preservation conversations, this is a series that Preservation Massachusetts started in 2020 in the midst of the global pandemic as a way to connect with our constituents across the Commonwealth and also as a way to share helpful resources for constituents who are participating in historic preservation projects. As I mentioned, the focus of this first preservation conversation of 2022 is going to be on the Massachusetts Most Endangered Historic Resource Program. So today I'm going to be going over the 2022 program and its timeline and going through a step-by-step guide to the Most Endangered Resources application. So I'll be going through a lot of information today. So if you guys have any questions as we move forward, feel free to put your questions in the comments or in the chat, and we'll hopefully have some time at the end to answer a few of those questions. This video is also being recorded and will be available on our website as well as our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. So if there's something you missed or you want to rewatch, feel free to return to this video at your leisure. My contact information will also be shared at the end of this presentation. So if you have any other questions after this event, please feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to work with you. That being said, let's go ahead and get started here. So first, I thought we'd start with a little bit of background on our Most Endangered project. The Most Endangered Resource Program is one that maybe a lot of you will be familiar with. It's a quite popular advocacy and outreach initiative that a number of statewide and nonprofit organizations in historic preservation use as a means to highlight and advocate for endangered historic resources, such as buildings, historic landscapes, bridges, reservoirs, the list goes on. Now, our Most Endangered program originated in 1993, and it's a program we host every other year. Now, the Most Endangered program is only an honorary distinction, And while there is no direct funding that we can provide for your resource, there are a number of benefits for applying and getting on the most endangered list. For example, being listed on the most endangered list allows your historic resource to reach a larger statewide audience. And it also allows our staff to prioritize our outreach and advocacy initiatives across the Commonwealth. Specifically, if your resource is listed on our most endangered list, our preservation circuit riders are on the ground, in the field representatives who work with preservation projects and communities across the Commonwealth will prioritize these projects throughout the year and the next year as well. Now, I would note here at this point that the Most Endangered program should not be seen as a last resort for saving a historic resource. Rather, treat this program as a way to build connections and to raise awareness for your endangered historic resource. Now, all of the resources that we've listed over the past several years, and all of the resources that will be listed in 2022 are unique, as are the challenges they face. So if you're curious about how the Most Endangered program could work, or if you know of a resource that you think would be good for this program, reach out to us and we'll be happy to work with you and answer any questions that you might have. So if you've ever worked with our Most Endangered project before, or if you've reviewed any of the application materials from the last couple of sessions, you'll note that a few things have changed for the 2022 program. For example, in past years, we've asked applicants to submit 2 applications, one print and one digital. And this year, we've created a new online nomination application, which could be filled out and submitted directly from our website. You can see a picture of the home screen of that nomination portal on the slide here. This year, we're also using a 2-part selection process to review all the nominations for the 2022 list. During our review process, Preservation Massachusetts staff will work with a number of highly qualified volunteers from our historic preservation community to score and generate our 2022 list. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about how that works here in a moment. Typically, all of the nominations are scored based on a number of criteria, including the historical significance of the resource, the nature of the threat, the community's commitment to saving the historic resource, as well as its geographic distribution. This year, we'll also be trying a month-long preservation public awareness campaign to raise awareness for all of the most endangered resources this year. Now, in past years, we've tried to hold one large event to celebrate all of the endangered resources. And this year, we've decided to shake it up a little bit, bringing this preservation awareness directly to you and your communities. So if your resource is listed this year, you'll have the opportunity to work with Preservation Massachusetts staff to set up an optional in-person site visit, where our staff will come to your community and present your resource with the 2022 Most Endangered Resource Certificate, which signifies that your resource is historically significant and continues to be important for its community. In addition, all listed resources will receive a personalized press release, which you could use for your own publicity for the event. And all of the endangered resources will be featured on Preservation Massachusetts website and social media, bringing more awareness to these sites to a statewide community. Now, the theme for the 2022 Most Endangered Resources program is Planning for Community. And this year, we're interested in featuring resources that are not only historically significant, but continue to be important and provide possibilities for their communities. Now, keep this in mind as we go through. This theme is going to play a big role in how we assess the nominees this year, and it will also play a big role in some of the questions on the application itself. Now, briefly, I'd like to go over a bit of the timeline for the program this year. So currently, Preservation in Massachusetts is accepting nomination applications through our website. The hard deadline for submitting an application is August 31st by 5 p.m. If you have any questions or difficulties submitting an application, please let us know and we'll work with you directly. In September and October, our selection committee will start reviewing the nominees. In September, we'll begin our initial scoring process, and by October, our staff and volunteers will come together to generate the formal list of 2022 endangered resources. And by October 31st, all applicants will be notified of the status of their resource, whether or not they've been admitted on the list. Now, while not every resource will make it onto the list, I want to let everybody know that all of the resources will still receive help and guidance from Preservation Massachusetts. So nobody will leave completely empty-handed. And finally, in November, there will be a public introduction of the 2022 Most Endangered list during our Most Endangered Historic Resources Month. That's when we'll schedule the optional site visits and do press releases about the endangered resources. So now that we've talked a little bit about the program itself, let's talk about the application process, everybody's favorite part. So as I mentioned at the beginning, our application has changed a little bit this year, and it is now available digitally on our website. So to access our nomination application, simply visit the Preservation Massachusetts website, which I've included here on the screen, and go to the Most Endangered Resource page. There, as you can see here on the screen, circled in red, is a big box labeled MER Application. Click the link there, and you'll be directed to the application form, which you can fill out and submit right there. This year, the MER application consists of 3 parts. First, a resource and nomination background, a historical background and community significance section, and finally, a space to include additional required and supplementary supporting materials. Now, an important thing to keep in mind as you go through the nomination application process is that once you open and start filling in the nomination form, you will not be able to save your work. So this isn't something you can start on one day and X out of to continue another day. You have to do it in one sitting. So in order to help your process and to give you a way to plan your responses before you begin the application, we've created the MER application prep sheet, which is also available on our website by going to the how-to guide section. Now, this application prep sheet is very similar to the presentation I'm giving today. It includes all pertinent information about the Most Endangered program, as well as a step-by-step guide to the application itself. So please take a look at this to plan your responses before submitting the application. So now let's turn to the application questions themselves. So as I mentioned, it has 3 parts, and we'll begin with part 1, the resource and nomination background. So in part 1, you'll be asked to give basic information regarding the resource itself, its name, its address, whether or not it's public or private, and what legislative district it's in. Now, if you need to find information about its legislative district, you can visit www.house.gov, which is located right here on the screen. We have a link, and you can search your legislative district by the resources zip code. Also, during part 1, you'll be able to indicate the nature of the threat that's affecting your endangered resource. There's a drop-down link, which you can see here, where you could click all the threats that apply to your resource, whether it's abandonment or long-term non-use, demolition, arson, or foreclosure, or all of the above. Also, you'll be able to link information about the nominator and the owner of the resource. Now, while it's not required, we do recommend that you get in touch with the owner of your endangered resource and collaborate with them on this nomination. Now, as part of our application review process, Preservation Massachusetts does reach out and notify the owner when a nomination is turned in for their resource. So please keep that in mind. Finally, in this section, you could also include information for a media contact that you'd like us to work with. So let's say, for example, you know somebody who works at a local newspaper or runs a local website that you'd like us to contact about your resource. And if your resource is listed, send them the press release. You can include this information here. If you don't have a media contact, don't worry, we won't take off points. This is completely optional, but it provides you another way, or it provides us another way to get out information about your resource to your community. Once you've completed part 1, move right on to part 2, which is the historical background and community significance section. Now, this section is a little longer. This is a narrative section where you'll be able to talk in greater detail about the historical background of your resource and detail the members of your community who were involved in attempting to save it. Now, each question in this section, you'll be able to get a long text box where you could type as much or as little as you want to answer the questions. Although keep in mind that you're trying to be compelling with your responses. So make sure that your responses are clear, concise, and compelling as you go through. So first in this section, you'll be asked to give an overview summary of your resource, its challenge, and how the Most Endangered program will help in your efforts to preserve it. Now, if we think of this section as a 5-paragraph essay, like one that you would write in high school or college, think of this overview as your introduction. So, like any introduction, you're going to want to keep it brief. Typically here, we're looking for somewhere between 250 or 300 words. And you really want to just start here by hitting the highlights. What is your resource? What are the threats? And why does it matter that we should save this? Don't worry about going into too much detail in this section. You'll be able to go into more detail in the following questions. Next, we'll ask you to describe the physical and contextual description of your endangered resource. So tell us about the main features of the resource and its surrounding areas. Does the site continue to retain its original historical character, or has it been moved or altered over the years? Is this site currently vacant, or is it occupied? Is it owned by a public entity, or is it a private dwelling or private resource? And does the site have any protective regulations, such as preservation restrictions, or is it located within a historical district? Now, if you're unsure about where to find information to answer this question, we do have a couple of resources available for you to look. For example, our friends at the Massachusetts Historical Commission maintain a searchable database of historic buildings and historic areas in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Typically, this contains information about the architectural design of the buildings or the historical significance, and sometimes also includes historical images, as well as links to a National Register listing as well. So this is a great place to start, and you can search for your resource by name or by address and town. Now, if your resource is located within a historical district, you could also reach out to your local historical commission, work with them to see if you could find information about this resource to fill in some of the gaps. Next, describe the resource's historical, architectural, and cultural significance, and tell us what the resource's role has been in your community over time. Now, most importantly, in this historical section, remind us, your audience, why the resource is significant, and what about the resource and its significance makes it so important to be saved. Now, we're all history buffs here, and it's very easy for us to go into long, over detail about the historical significance. And what we found in the past from reviewing applications is that a lot of people spend a lot of time on this section and then tend to lose sight on some of the other answers. So my advice to you as you're planning your response to this historical significance section is don't lose sight of the community impact, its historical and cultural significance. And I can tell you from experience of writing a number of papers that just merely summarizing historical events and dates doesn't always make for the most compelling reading. So keep your audience in mind while you're writing this and make sure that they don't lose sight of your goal, which is telling us why your historical resource should continue to matter. Now, in this section, you're also free to submit and attach National Register survey forms or other survey forms that will help complement your answer. Next, we'll ask you to describe the threat that is associated with your endangered resource. Be specific here and tell us the immediacy of the threat. Quantify it within a realm of 3, 6, or 12 months. Is the threat to your endangered resource immediate, or is this something that's looming in the distance? Now, much like the historic significance section, please be sure to reiterate and re-emphasize how the loss of this historic resource will impact your community. Next, you'll be asked to talk about your community's commitment for saving this historic resource. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, our theme for the 2022 Most Endangered Resource Program is planning for community. So in this section, we'd like our nominators to reflect on how they have reached out and engaged with members of their community to raise awareness for their historic resource. And so in this section, it's going to be a little different. We're asking nominators to attach a typed narrative of about a page where they discuss who all has been involved in trying to save the resource and to what extent they have worked to expand public awareness of this resource in their broader community. Tell us if you've started a support group or created a social media campaign to save this resource. Detail whether or not you've worked with your historical commission or reached out to town and city planners or the mayors, or if you've partnered with other organizations. Let us know if there's anybody who is opposed to the preservation of this resource, and if so, tell us why. Now, if you're just starting off trying to protect this resource, tell us how you plan on reaching out and connecting with your community. And finally, let us know if there are any firm or potential financial commitments to saving this resource, such as utilizing the Community Preservation Act, using preservation grants, or if there are donations from private citizens. Now, just like with the historical significance section, we'd encourage you to include any newspaper articles or links to websites or social media posts or letters of support from individuals or community organizations that show community support for your endangered resource. Now, building community engagement and support for your resource is not something you'll be able to do overnight. This takes a lot of planning to do so. If you are looking for good strategies to do so, feel free to reach out to us and we can give you a couple tips and tricks for how you might connect with your community. But the best the best way to start is to reach out. If your resource is something that is indeed worth saving, share with your community its historical significance and work with them to find some useful solutions for it. Now, finally, in this section, we'll ask you to talk about your possible future plans for this endangered resource. So tell us some of your ideas for how you might save this resource or negate the threats that are associated with us. You can also describe any feasible future plans that you have for using the resource in your community, whether this means using it for a different purpose and adapting it in a different way, or how you will use it to inspire growth and positivity in your community. Now, we're not asking you to have come prepared with a 40-page proposal for how you're going to turn your historic home into a coffee shop or axe throwing facility, although that would be cool. But what we're looking for you to do here is to have thought a little more broadly about how this historic resource can be used to better your community. Now, if you're looking for examples of how other historic preservation projects have been used and have been adapted to better their community, Preservation Massachusetts has quite the archive of preservation examples on our website, on our social media, and on our YouTube channel. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we celebrated 19 individuals and projects that exemplified adapting and reusing historic preservation or historic resources in their communities. So be sure to check those out on our website. So once you've completed the first and second parts of your application, we'll move on to the final part, which are including any additional supporting documents and materials that you'll need to complete your application. Now, if you have any additional survey forms, historic landscape forms, or other historical documentation about your historic resource, be sure to include those in your application. There will be a drop box on the form for you to attach additional files. We're also asking that applicants include at least 5 to 10 digital images of their historic resource. Now, these images can be from present day, or they can be historical. Regardless, please ensure that these images are saved in a digital format, either JPEG or TIFF, and be sure to include the photographer credits if you didn't take the photograph yourself. Next, be sure to include a map of your endangered resource. This could be as easy as going to Google Maps and taking a screen grab of the page and submitting that as an image. Finally, if you haven't already, be sure to include any other relevant newspaper articles, editorials, or letters of support talking about your endangered resource and showing community support for saving that resource. Again, anything else you have in your arsenal that will help us understand the context of your resource and your community's efforts to save it will be helpful for us in determining if your resource can be listed on our website. Now, once you've done all that, congratulations, you are ready to submit your application. Before you do so, make sure that all of the information you've provided is complete and accurate. And if we have questions about your application, our staff will reach out with any questions or concerns that we might have. Please also make sure for the written portions in part 2 of your application, make sure that all of these narratives are clear and concise. Presentation does matter. And also be sure, after you've submitted your application, if there are any changes that occur with your endangered resource, to let us know so that we can stay up to date on the status of your resource as we make our final selections. And just as a final reminder, all of these applications have a hard deadline of August 31st by 5 p.m. to be submitted. So once again, if you're having any troubles finding relevant information, or if you're having troubles submitting your form, please reach out to our staff and we will help you as best we can to make sure that you can submit this information to us. So now that we've gone over the application and the program itself, I'd like to wrap up my portion of this conversation by sharing a couple extra resources with you guys that you can take advantage of as you're preparing your MER applications. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, we will be offering 2 additional preservation conversations about the Most Endangered Resource Program. Coming up in June, we will be hosting MER 201, which is called Defining Success. And during this presentation, we'll be talking with a couple of people who have previously submitted applications to the Most Endangered Resource Program. So you'll be able to hear directly from your constituents about their experiences working with our program, as well as their experiences, pitfalls, challenges, and successes working with an historic resource. And then in July, we'll be hosting MER 301, Planning for the Future. And here we'll give a couple helpful tools and resources to help you guys develop business plans for your endangered resource, taking it from the nomination stage to a successful completion of your project. So we'll have more details and information about those 2 conversations available on our website here in the coming weeks, so stay tuned for details. I've also included here a couple of helpful links and resources that you guys can use, including a link to our Most Endangered page on our website and a link to the MER application prep sheet. And I've also included a link here to a resource we call our Roadmap to Historic Preservation Success. I've included an image of that on our slide here. And this takes you through the basics of building a plan for a successful historic preservation project, all the way from identifying an issue with the historic resource, to working with your community, to framing and writing your message, and coming to a successful outcome. Once again, all of this information, including this PowerPoint, will be available on our website, so you can go back and reference this as well at any time. Finally, I've included my contact information here, both my email and my phone number. So if any of you have any questions once we're done here today, feel free to reach out and I'll be happy to help as best I can. So that is the end of this presentation. I know I went through a lot of information today. So as promised, if you guys have any questions that you'd like to ask, we'd be happy to answer them here. So thanks so much for listening in so diligently. All right, let's take a look here at the chat. So it looks like one of our first questions here is how many properties will make it onto the endangered resources list? There's not typically a set number, and this is something we've experimented with throughout the years. We started this program by doing a top 10 list. We moved that to 12. In 2020, because of all of the global issues that we were dealing with, we only ended up with 3 nominations. So we don't typically set a number for how many are listed. It always depends on the number of applications that we receive. Looks like we have another question here. Why is the program only run every other year? Typically, we alternate this program with our statewide preservation conference, which is our other big advocacy and outreach campaign here at Preservation Massachusetts. But this also gives us time to adequately assess the issues related to our most endangered resources and give us enough time to work with them so they can hopefully achieve some positive preservation outcomes. So we have a really good question here about how many Native American groups or indigenous persons are invited and participate in our decision-making for MER. That's a great question. So we are currently in the midst of building our selection committee team. Typically, these committee members are chosen from the preservation field across the state. Sometimes it has to do with, geographic locations where the most resources are coming in. But depending on the projects, we will invite a number of people with a number of different backgrounds and professions to join in to be part of those conversations. Let's see. Okay, we have another question here. Could an environmental resource, such as a rare animal or plant, be listed on our nomination? Typically, we define our endangered resources in terms of buildings or structures or preservation landscapes. So we don't typically focus merely on things such as rare animals or specific plants. I'm happy to, if you have more questions about that, you can reach out to me directly and we can have a conversation about that. We do also provide an definition of what we consider historic resources on our website, and that definition is also available on our application prep sheet as well. All right, looks like another question we have. Are historical commissions encouraged to spearhead these applications? So generally, we receive applications from both private individuals and public organizations. So we accept all sorts of applications. If you are a private individual who is just starting out to save a historic resource, it's always a good idea to reach out to your historical commission and collaborate with them if possible. Although, again, it is not required. And it looks like we have another question about, is the MER independent of the Massachusetts Historical Commission? It is. This is a program that we host. And though we partner with MHC on a number of projects, this is one that stands alone from their work. All right. Another question we have here is, does the applicant have to reside in Massachusetts to submit? This is an excellent question. No, you do not need to be in Massachusetts. However, the resource you nominate does have to be in the state of Massachusetts in order for it to qualify. See here. All right, looks like we have one more question here again about the rare plants or animals. Again, we typically focus on historic landscapes or historic structures, whether they be buildings or bridges or barns. And again, I'll have my email. Again, you guys have my contact information. If you have more questions about this, we can talk privately about that and we could work out something. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. Does anybody quickly have any other questions that they'd like to shout out before we end our program today? All right, well, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, Tyler, do you have a question?
I do. What if, in the situation I'm thinking about is Native American historical site with their artifacts. And in the situation there is, there's a battle going on because of some construction that they want to do for the state. And there's been a big fight about it. However, some of the things that are going on, if we apply to you guys and have, I take it this is kind of an independent group, right? I mean, this is like citizenry and common sense as opposed to thinking about the economic only value, because in this particular site, the reason I'm talking about animals is there are very rare plants there that do not exist anywhere else in Massachusetts. And there's one site that has a very rare turtle. And this is another site completely. And it was a ceremonial stone site. And what they did was they put solar panels there, and it was quite terrible because they cut the entire forest down, and the ceremonial stone sites were protecting these rare turtles. And now they're finding the dead shells, empty shells of the turtles, which are quite rare. They're kind of a box turtle or something. So there's, that kind of a thing is why I was mentioning, I know it's about historical sites, but does that add to the impact if we were to put that in the application, that, by the way, this is also hurting something that's kind of rare to, and might be endangered. They are endangered, some of them, so.
Well, thanks for the clarification, Ms. Chase. That does help my understanding out a little bit. It sounds like in that case, you are not just preserving the animals, but the actual land itself. This is a sacred site for the indigenous people here in Massachusetts. And absolutely, that would qualify as being a most endangered resource. And you are welcome to put forward a nomination about the land itself, including information about the potential loss of that very rare and endangered wildlife could be something that you could include in the application as that supporting evidence, showing why it would be significant if the site was lost or damaged. So yeah, absolutely, that would be great information to include. Great question, thank you. All right, anybody else have any questions? Feel free to unmute and shout out if you do. All right, hearing none, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you today for tuning in to listen to my ramblings. I hope you found it helpful. As I said, in the next couple of weeks, we will have this information, this video, as well as my PowerPoint presentation available on our website. And again, if you guys have any questions about anything as you move forward with your applications, please reach out and let me know. And thanks for your time today, guys.